December 1942. Before sunrise, the jungle around Buna is already awake, a living organism of steam, rot, and quiet hostility. American soldiers of the 32nd Infantry Division stand knee-deep in mud that clings to their legs like hands trying to pull them under. Their uniforms are soaked long before the first shot of the day. Sweat runs even in the shade. Mosquitoes orbit every face. Breath smells of damp canvas and fatigue. In the dim light, nothing moves. Yet every leaf seems alive. To these men, many barely out of civilian life in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, Buna is barely a name. A dot on a map, a distant assignment in a war that had begun only a year earlier for the United States. But here, in this strip of New Guinea coastline, they will learn a truth their commanders never said aloud: the Pacific is not a battlefield. It is a predator. The Japanese positions ahead are invisible, buried in a lattice of bunkers woven from coconut logs, sand, and earth. They vanish into the jungle with a precision that defies the American eye. Scouts whisper that some are so well camouflaged you can stand a meter away and still see nothing. Inside them, Japanese machine gunners wait silently, rifles wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the moisture at bay. A sergeant signals forward. Slowly, the line begins to move. The mud does not yield. Every step is a negotiation. The rifles jam more often than expected. Dust covers open on their own, bolts resist movement. Helmets drip constantly. Boots are never dry. Nothing in basic training prepared them for this. In North America, war meant tanks, movement, fire, and maneuver. Here, the tank trails sink into swamp. The maneuver dies in the undergrowth. By midday, the temperature climbs above 36 degrees Celsius. The air thickens like breathing through cloth. Even the calmest soldiers feel something tightening around their nerves. The soundscape is wrong. The jungle is loud, but the enemy is silent. That silence is worse than noise. It suggests patience. It suggests control. A single shot breaks it. Then the world erupts. Machine guns hammer from angles no one expected. Bullets slice leaves into confetti. Men drop into the mud, not just for cover but because there is nowhere else to go. Radio men struggle to find a signal. Officers shout orders lost in the roar. The advance stalls before it even begins. Within minutes, confidence, that invisible reserve every army carries into battle, dissolves under the weight of a landscape that rejects them. Later, survivors will say Buna felt less like a battlefield and more like a test. A test of endurance, of improvisation, of identity. A test the United States had not yet learned how to pass. This was the first moment many American soldiers understood the truth. The jungle does not care who you are, and it does not fear the United States. By mid-1942, Washington believed it understood the Pacific. The United States had studied Japanese aircraft, naval doctrine, and the opening moves after Pearl Harbor. Analysts in the War Department knew the Imperial Japanese Army fought with discipline, entrenched positions, and a willingness to defend every meter of ground. What they had not grasped, not fully, was the terrain that shaped those soldiers and the way that terrain would dismantle American assumptions one by one. New Guinea appeared on maps as a green mass the size of California, positioned like a gate between the Central and South Pacific. Its jungles were marked simply as forest or swamp. On the ground, these labels meant something else. Endless mangrove thickets, kunai grass taller than a man, ridgelines that disappeared into cloud, and coastal lowlands where mud swallowed boots whole. The air itself felt heavy enough to slow thought. Yet Buna and Gunna, two small coastal outposts on Papua's northeastern shore, suddenly became vital. In July 1942, Japanese forces had landed there with a plan that aimed directly at Australia. If they could push across the Owen Stanley Range and take Port Moresby, they would threaten Allied lifelines stretching from San Francisco to Brisbane. Australia might be isolated. The United States would lose its southern anchor in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, recently evacuated from the Philippines, understood the stakes but not the terrain. His headquarters in Brisbane operated with maps that were often outdated, some based on pre-war missionary surveys. Distances looked manageable on paper. In reality, every kilometer of New Guinea felt like a separate world. American units arriving in Australia were green. Many belonged to the National Guard, mobilized after Pearl Harbor with limited training in tropical warfare. The 32nd Infantry Division, the unit soon to be thrown against Buna, had practiced maneuvers in Louisiana pine forests, not equatorial swamps. Their officers were competent, but had never faced an enemy who dug bunkers into ground so wet that it collapsed under the weight of shovels. MacArthur needed men quickly, and the 32nd was available. They were flown in on C-47 transports, the first large combat airlifted division in U.S. history. It sounded bold. It looked innovative. But the reality was harsher. Equipment was left behind because aircraft could not carry everything. Heavy weapons, generators, medical supplies. Much of it arrived weeks later or not at all. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers under Major General Hari had fortified Buna and Gunna with a precision that stunned even seasoned observers. Their bunkers were interlocking, reinforced with coconut logs that could stop .30 caliber rounds. Fields of fire overlapped. Snipers built nests high in palm trees. Machine gun pits were concealed behind walls of vegetation. To an American advancing through the undergrowth, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The United States assumed its material advantage. Firepower, mobility, logistics would compensate. But New Guinea neutralized these strengths. Artillery sank in the mud. Trucks stalled on improvised tracks. Tanks bogged down within meters of leaving hard ground. Even medical evacuation became a nightmare. Wounded men had to be carried by hand through swamp water alive with parasites. For American planners, Buna and Gunna were supposed to be an offensive opportunity. Instead, they became a mirror reflecting every flaw in early U.S. jungle warfare doctrine. What emerged in late 1942 was a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The United States was entering one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and it had done so blind. The first American push toward Buna began not with a coordinated assault, but with a slow, grinding walk through a landscape that resisted every step. Soldiers expected movement. What they got was stagnation. Patrols advanced 5 meters, sometimes 10, before halting again. Nothing in their field manuals resembled what they faced now. The trail north of Saputa dissolved quickly into swamp. What looked solid from a distance became a trembling surface of waterlogged earth that swallowed boots past the ankle. Men used fallen logs as stepping stones, balancing with rifles raised overhead. A single misstep meant sinking into mud that smelled of rot and left a film of dark slime on their hands. Ahead, the Japanese waited. These were not large units, often platoons, sometimes even squads, but their positions were masterpieces of defensive engineering. A bunker might sit only 20 meters away, yet remain invisible until it opened fire. The Japanese had carved firing ports the size of a fist into walls of coconut logs thicker than railroad ties. Bullets striking them made a dull, heavy thud, as if hitting stone. American units tried to maneuver, but the jungle allowed no room for flanking. Every path channeled them forward. Every attempt to detour ended in flooded ground where movement became impossible. Maps lost meaning. Compass bearings were useless when the canopy blocked the sky for hours. Communications faltered. Radios crackled with humidity, their signals fading under the thick foliage. Officers attempted to coordinate platoons by shouting, but voices carried unpredictably in the jungle, sometimes traveling far, sometimes disappearing instantly. Orders arrived late or not at all. Frustration began to seep into the ranks. Young soldiers who had expected a straightforward fight found themselves pinned down by an enemy they could not see. Some fired at shapes. Others conserved ammunition, unsure where the next supply drop would land. Even water intake became a tactical question. Canteens ran dry faster than expected, and streams were contaminated by bacteria invisible to the naked eye. The Japanese exploited every advantage. Snipers positioned in high branches waited for hours without moving. When they fired, the crack echoed strangely, bouncing between trunks in a way that made direction impossible to identify. Machine gun bursts seemed to come from everywhere, then nowhere, as if the jungle itself were attacking. One platoon attempted to crawl forward, believing they had located a bunker. They advanced 2 meters before a concealed firing port erupted, sending dirt and splinters into the air. The lead scout fell instantly. The rest froze, pressed flat against the ground that offered no cover, only mud. By nightfall, the line had gained almost nothing. Men returned to their assembly points exhausted, uniforms sagging with moisture, rifles coated in grime. They cleaned weapons with rags that never fully dried. They wrung sweat from sleeves. Mosquitoes continued their relentless assault. The jungle did not pause at night, it simply changed its sounds. And in whispered conversations, a new realization spread. The Japanese were not just defending Buna. They were using the jungle itself as an ally, and the United States had walked straight into an environment designed to defeat them. What was supposed to be a probing attack had revealed something far more troubling. The first American advance had gone nowhere, and they were already paying for it. By late November 1942, the American advance had slowed to the point that it was no longer an advance at all. Units were holding positions that were little more than muddy depressions in the ground. The 32nd Infantry Division had entered New Guinea expecting short supply lines and regular resupply. Instead, their lifeline depended on a handful of C-47s navigating unpredictable weather over the Owen Stanley Range. Every aspect of logistics began collapsing under the weight of the jungle. Ammunition arrived sporadically, crates dropped from aircraft often shattered on impact, scattering rounds into the muck. Some were recovered, others lost forever beneath the surface. Mortar shells sweated moisture inside their casings. Machine gun belts rusted. Even dry rations turned soft within hours. Medical supplies were worse. Plasma bags burst from heat. Bandages mildewed inside sealed tins. The simplest wound, a cut from barbed wire, a gash from slipping on a wet log, became a gateway to infection. Tropical ulcers spread across legs and arms like slow-moving rot. The stench was unmistakable. Water was a constant threat. Soldiers refilled canteens from streams clouded with silt and invisible parasites. Chlorine tablets masked some contaminants, but dysentery still tore through the ranks. Men grew weak, losing weight rapidly as fever took hold. Malaria became so widespread that entire platoons reported to sick call on the same morning. The Japanese, better acclimated and defending fixed positions, suffered less. Their bunkers, raised slightly above ground, kept them dry. Their water sources were protected and filtered through makeshift charcoal layers. They used mosquito nets religiously. Americans, moving constantly through swamp and brush, had no such stability. Even clothing became a liability. Wet uniforms chafed skin raw, then peeled. Boots softened until they lost shape, their soles slipping off in the mud. Helmets trapped heat, turning every movement into an effort. Rifles corroded so quickly that soldiers carried pieces of cloth soaked in oil simply to keep bolts functioning. The psychological cost grew heavier each day. Sleep was shallow, haunted by the buzzing of insects and the constant awareness that Japanese patrols moved silently at night. Men woke to find leeches attached in clusters. Others discovered mold growing on the stock of their rifles. Small rituals emerged. Some soldiers scraped fungus from their boots with bayonets. Others wrapped socks around rifle barrels to prevent rust. These acts were not just practical, they were attempts to reclaim control in an environment that stripped control away. Food shortages worsened. Rations arrived late or in insufficient quantities. Hunger sharpened tempers and slowed movements. Soldiers talked obsessively about meals back home: pancakes, roast beef, hot coffee, small comforts that felt impossibly distant. Their bodies ran on the minimum energy required to survive. Leadership struggled to maintain morale. Officers delivered orders with confidence they did not feel. They wrote reports describing the jungle as increasingly difficult, an understatement that barely hinted at reality. Higher command in Brisbane still believed the offensive could proceed for weeks. But the men in the swamp knew better. They felt it in their legs, swollen from infection. In their eyes, stinging from sweat and humidity. In their lungs, laboring against the dense air. And in their minds, slowly worn down by exhaustion and fear. By the end of the month, the question was no longer whether the Americans could take Buna quickly. It was whether they could hold their lines long enough to avoid total collapse. To understand why the American advance stalled at Buna and Gunna, one must first understand the architecture of Japanese defense. The Imperial Japanese Army did not simply occupy the jungle, it reshaped it. Every bunker, every trench, every sniper post was placed with mathematical intention. The result was a defensive grid that merged with the terrain so completely that American soldiers could walk past a strongpoint without ever seeing it. Japanese bunkers were not crude shelters. They were feats of field engineering. Each structure was built from interlocking coconut logs, cut to uniform lengths and stacked in alternating layers. This lattice design absorbed shock and dispersed the impact of American small arms fire. The walls were often more than a meter thick, backed with sand and earth that further dampened penetration. Tests later showed that a standard .30-06 round fired from an M1 Garand could not breach them at close range. The firing ports, narrow slits carved with surgical precision, were angled downward to minimize incoming fire. A Japanese machine gunner could command a 50-meter kill zone while exposing only the width of a hand. From the American perspective, the enemy seemed invisible. Muzzle flashes were brief, sound bounced unpredictably through the canopy, and the bunker's dark interiors blended perfectly with the shadows of the forest. Ventilation systems were equally clever. Small shafts lined with split bamboo allowed airflow without revealing smoke or heat. Some bunkers had drainage ditches running beneath them, preventing the interior from flooding, a critical adaptation to New Guinea's relentless rain. But the brilliance of the design lay not in individual structures, but in how they were positioned. The Japanese built their defenses in depth. Bunkers overlapped fields of fire, creating interlocking triangles of lethal coverage. An American assault on one strongpoint inevitably exposed the attackers to fire from 2 or 3 others. Even when U.S. troops managed to neutralize a bunker, they often discovered a second line of defenses only meters behind it. Sniper positions were elevated in the palm canopy. Ladders carved from tree trunks were pulled up after the sniper climbed, leaving no trace. From these perches, marksmen could see movement long before Americans spotted them. Their shots, filtered through leaves, became ghost-like, audible but directionless. Japanese trenches, dug in zigzag patterns, connected bunkers into a network. These trenches were roofed with logs and earth, making them nearly invisible. Soldiers could move between positions without exposing themselves to American fire. When U.S. troops believed they had isolated a bunker, Japanese reinforcements emerged from flanking trenches with sudden, coordinated fire. Even the placement of obstacles followed logic. Sharpened stakes hidden beneath shallow water. Wire woven through undergrowth. Pits disguised under palm leaves. Every detail served a single purpose: to slow the attackers long enough for well-concealed machine guns to cut them down. American commanders were initially baffled. Standard infantry tactics, assault teams supported by suppressive fire, failed repeatedly. Artillery support was difficult. Rounds exploded harmlessly against the outer layers of logs. Mortars, fired from soft ground, lost accuracy. Tanks bogged down long before reaching firing range. Soldiers described the Japanese positions as alive, as if the jungle itself had been weaponized. They were not far from the truth. Japanese engineers had built fortifications that used the environment, not resisted it. And the Americans, unprepared for this degree of adaptation, found themselves facing an opponent whose greatest weapon was not steel, but the mastery of terrain. In the weeks ahead, these bunkers would become the center of every battle report, every casualty list, and every frustrated command directive. The United States had encountered the most formidable defensive system it had yet seen in the Pacific, and it would cost them dearly to break it. American commanders knew they had to break the Japanese bunker system, but few understood how. Doctrine offered little guidance. The manuals written before the war focused on European landscapes, open fields, roads, stone villages. Buna offered none of that. Instead, it offered mud, heat, and defensive lines invisible until they fired. So the first assaults followed patterns that looked sensible on paper, and suicidal in the jungle. Platoons formed up in tight formations, attempting to advance in coordinated waves. But the terrain compressed them into narrow channels between swamp and brush. What should have been a broad attack became a thin column of men moving single file, rifles raised, nerves taut. When the first bunker opened fire, the formation collapsed into the mud, bodies piled behind fallen comrades because there was simply nowhere else to go. Machine gun teams attempted to lay down suppressive fire. Their tripods sank into the ground, tilting the barrels upward. The tracers hissed through leaves 2 meters above their intended path, useless against bunkers buried waist-deep in earth. Japanese gunners waited for the Americans to reveal their positions, then answered with precise bursts that snapped branches and punched through helmets. Mortar crews suffered even worse. Their baseplates disappeared into the sludge, throwing off every angle. Rounds fell short or overshot targets, sometimes landing dangerously close to friendly positions. In one sector, a mortar team fired an entire crate without scoring a single effective hit, each shell detonating harmlessly outside the Japanese log walls. Even flamethrowers, the weapon theoretically ideal for bunker clearing, became liabilities. Fuel tanks leaked in the humidity. Ignition systems misfired. Operators, burdened with heavy gear, moved slowly, perfect targets. Japanese marksmen learned to identify the silhouette instantly. Flamethrower crews rarely survived the first attempt. Frustration grew into a kind of grim resignation. Soldiers began to realize the pattern. Every attack began with hope, surged into chaos, then dissolved into stalled movement under invisible gunfire. Casualty lists expanded, yet maps showed no change. Reports used phrases like limited progress and localized gains, language that concealed the reality that the lines had barely shifted more than a few meters. One of the most catastrophic moments occurred when an American company attempted to flank what they believed was the edge of a Japanese position. They moved in silence, cutting a path through razor grass, stepping carefully to avoid noise. After 20 minutes, they emerged into what looked like open ground, only to discover it was a killing zone pre-sighted by 2 concealed machine guns. The first burst dropped half the lead platoon. The survivors crawled backward, dragging the wounded, leaving equipment behind in the mud. Tanks were supposed to be the equalizer. The U.S. deployed M3 Stuart light tanks, small enough to navigate tight spaces, in theory. In practice, the moment they left solid ground their tracks spun helplessly in the muck. One tank made it within 20 meters of a bunker before losing traction. Immobilized, it drew fire from every direction. Its crew bailed out under a storm of bullets, 2 cut down before reaching cover. Even when the tanks did move, they struggled to identify targets. Jungle shadows played tricks on depth perception. Bunkers appeared only as vague shapes. Gunners fired high-explosive rounds that shredded foliage but rarely damaged Japanese positions. After each failed assault, the line fell quiet. Men cleaned rifles that would be dirty again within minutes. Officers tried to motivate troops who had begun to doubt the very possibility of success. Letters home became shorter, more guarded. The jungle felt heavier, more hostile, as if absorbing every setback and feeding it back into the soldiers' morale. What the Americans did not yet grasp was this. They were fighting a battle of attrition that favored the defender. And every failed attack strengthened the Japanese conviction that Buna could hold indefinitely. The United States had the manpower and industrial power to continue. But power meant little when every plan unraveled the moment it touched New Guinea's soil. By early December 1942, the American front around Buna was held together less by discipline than by inertia. Soldiers did not speak openly of collapse, but every movement, every exhausted glance, hinted at it. The jungle had not merely slowed them, it had begun to dissolve the very fabric of the units fighting within it. Fatigue took its toll first. Men collapsed after short marches, their bodies dehydrated and feverish. Officers reported soldiers falling asleep standing up, leaning on rifles for support. NCOs had to shake men awake before dawn patrols. What sleep they managed was broken by nightmares, mosquito swarms, and the omnipresent humidity that made even rest feel suffocating. Malaria spread like a silent artillery barrage. One battalion logged more than 400 cases in a single week. Chills and fever cycles left men trembling uncontrollably, then sweating through their uniforms. Quinine supplies were limited, and even when available, its bitter taste and side effects made some soldiers avoid it, a decision that often cost them their strength days later. Dysentery further weakened the ranks. Latrines were impossible to dig properly in flooded ground. Bacteria spread through contaminated water and unwashed hands. Men grew gaunt, their belts cinched tighter each day. The simple act of standing became an effort. Skin infections became so severe that medics described them as open craters. Bandages adhered permanently to wounds. Some soldiers could not wear boots without intense pain. Others marched barefoot, risking cuts that quickly turned septic. But morale did not collapse all at once. It frayed slowly, in small, private moments. A soldier staring at a picture from home for too long. A rifleman hesitating before entering the grass where a friend had fallen. A squad exchanging fewer words as days blended into indistinguishable misery. Food shortages deepened the emotional strain. Canned meat turned rancid in the heat. Bread crumbled into paste. Coffee was almost non-existent. Men resorted to eating half portions, then quarter portions. Hunger sharpened irritability. Fights broke out over trivial issues, a misplaced tool, a misinterpreted order, a rumor about supplies. Mail from home became painfully inconsistent. Some received letters weeks old, describing a world of warmth and normalcy. Others received nothing at all. Jealousy, shame, and longing mixed into a quiet ache that settled in the background of every conversation. Commanders sensed the decline but struggled to counter it. They delivered speeches about duty and perseverance, but their own eyes betrayed fatigue. Reports to headquarters used cautious language, troops in fair condition, continuing resistance, maintaining operational capacity. None captured the truth. The jungle had stripped away the illusion of American invincibility. And worse, soldiers knew it. They saw it in the way newcomers reacted upon arriving, the shock, the disbelief, the whispered questions. Is this really the front? Those who had been there longest answered with hollow stares. Discipline held, but just barely. Units followed orders because routine was the only structure left. Yet even routine slipped. Patrols returned with fewer notes. Weapon inspections grew shorter. Officers found themselves repeating instructions that should have been instinctive. Fear added to the erosion. The Japanese attacked at unpredictable times, a sniper shot at dawn, a grenade thrown from a hidden trench at dusk. Men began to flinch at every rustle in the vegetation. Some refused to move forward without explicit orders. Others volunteered for dangerous tasks simply to escape the stagnation of waiting. Buna had become more than a battle. It was a crucible where physical endurance, mental resilience, and tactical competence were tested simultaneously, and the results were grim. This was the moment when many soldiers quietly stopped believing victory was inevitable. What remained was something simpler, harsher, and far more human. The raw instinct to survive another day. While the soldiers at the front struggled through mud, fever, and frustration, headquarters in Brisbane operated in a world of maps, briefings, and expectations that no longer aligned with reality. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, had staked his reputation on a swift counteroffensive to halt the Japanese drive toward Australia. Buna was supposed to be an early triumph, a demonstration that the United States could regain the initiative after months of retreat. But by December 1942, the situation no longer looked like an emerging victory, it resembled a slow-motion disaster. Reports arriving from the 32nd Infantry Division were ambiguous, carefully phrased to avoid sounding defeatist. Phrases like enemy resistance stronger than anticipated and terrain complicates movement hid the severity of what was unfolding. MacArthur's staff, many of whom had never seen jungle combat, interpreted these notes as obstacles to be overcome with determination, not signs of a deteriorating campaign. MacArthur himself had a unique sensitivity to public perception. After the fall of the Philippines, he needed Buna to validate his promise, "I shall return." Thus, pressure intensified on subordinate commanders to produce results. Measurable, reportable results, even when progress on the ground was nearly non-existent. Maps in headquarters used arrows that moved forward each week. In reality, the front barely shifted. General Robert Eichelberger, commander of I Corps, was ordered to the front to take Buna, or not come back alive, a directive that revealed both the urgency and the desperation forming at the top. Eichelberger, experienced and respected, arrived to find conditions far worse than any report had suggested. He walked through aid stations filled with malarial, skeletal men. He saw officers attempting to lead companies that were companies in name only, some down to half their effective strength. And he realized immediately that the situation had crossed into crisis. Eichelberger understood something MacArthur did not. This was not a failure of courage, but a failure of doctrine and preparation. He sent blunt assessments back to headquarters. Men were too sick to fight. Weapons malfunctioned constantly. Supply lines were failing. Leadership structures were disintegrating under attrition. But blunt assessments were politically dangerous. MacArthur pushed back, insisting on renewed offensive action. He feared that any admission of weakness would embolden Japanese forces in the region and discourage Allied partners. Worse, a prolonged stalemate threatened to undermine confidence in American capability during a sensitive moment in the global war. Strategic tension began to build. MacArthur demanded momentum. Eichelberger demanded realism. And the 32nd Division demanded relief. Some staff officers urged a pause, even a withdrawal to reorganize, a suggestion quickly dismissed at Brisbane. The logic was cold but clear: yielding ground would signal defeat. Holding position, even under immense suffering, preserved symbolic strength. Meanwhile, intelligence intercepts suggested that Japanese reinforcements were moving south. If Buna became even more heavily defended, the United States might face not just a stalled battle, but a prolonged siege in terrain totally unsuited for one. MacArthur's frustration seeped into his directives. Orders grew sharper, deadlines shorter. He expected Eichelberger to restore efficiency to the front immediately, despite knowing that efficiency could not be restored to men who could barely stand. Eichelberger, walking the swamp trails every day, saw the truth. If something did not change, tactics, leadership, or reinforcements, the United States risked losing far more than a battle. It risked losing the credibility it needed to sustain operations across the entire Southwest Pacific. The pressure from above was growing. The suffering below was worsening. Buna was becoming a test not only of soldiers, but of generals, and of the entire American command system. When General Robert Eichelberger arrived at the front, the contrast between expectations and reality was so stark that even a seasoned commander needed a moment to take it in. The air reeked of infection and stagnant water. Aid stations overflowed with men whose bodies were failing faster than their commanders could record their names. Foxholes blurred with the swamp around them. Soldiers stood in knee-deep water because there was no dry ground to be found. Eichelberger didn't just inspect the situation, he immersed himself in it. Still wearing his service uniform, he slogged through mud that sucked at his boots, brushed aside kunai grass taller than his head, and spoke directly with officers and enlisted men alike. He listened to their accounts, asked technical questions about supply failures, examined malfunctioning rifles with his own hands. He wanted data, not excuses. What he discovered was worse than the reports. Companies listed at 140 men had fewer than 60 ready for duty. Platoons operated with one functioning radio between them, sometimes none. Ammunition arrived wet, food spoiled before distribution, and water sources were so contaminated that medics had stopped trying to sterilize them. Eichelberger made a private assessment. This division is no longer a division. It's a collection of exhausted survivors. He knew the Japanese were not stronger, they were simply prepared. American deficiencies were structural, not moral. So he began to reassert order with a precision that matched the chaos around him. His first directive was brutally simple: restore discipline. Not parade ground discipline, but operational discipline, the habits that keep units coherent under pressure. Even sick men cleaned weapons. Every patrol logged distances and bearings. Officers relearned the terrain through daily reconnaissance. No one was exempt. Then he addressed sanitation. Eichelberger understood that disease was destroying the division faster than Japanese bullets. He ordered new latrine positions on the driest ground available, enforced water purification tablets despite complaints, and reorganized medical evacuation procedures so that the sick and wounded reached aid stations before infections turned lethal. He also restructured command relationships. Officers who were ineffective were quietly reassigned, those who demonstrated initiative were promoted on the spot. He demanded clear lines of communication, insisting that every order be repeated back to confirm understanding, a small detail that prevented deadly confusion. But the most decisive change was tactical. Eichelberger abandoned broad front assaults and shifted to small, precise operations designed to isolate and destroy bunkers one by one. He ordered patrols to map Japanese fields of fire at night. He pushed engineers forward to clear trails, even under sniper pressure. He insisted that officers lead from the front, not from rear command posts. His presence became a force multiplier. Soldiers noticed that he walked the same paths they walked, endured the same heat, swatted the same mosquitoes. They respected his willingness to share their misery. Morale did not rebound instantly, but something changed. Men straightened when he approached. They spoke more firmly. They believed, if only slightly, that someone understood what they were enduring. Japanese commanders sensed the shift in American behavior. Fewer careless movements. Fewer failed assaults. More coordinated fire. More patience. Eichelberger's approach was not glamorous. It did not promise sweeping victories. It promised survival, and the slow, methodical destruction of the Japanese defensive ring. He had come to the front with an impossible order. Take Buna, or don't come back alive. But now he translated that order into something achievable. Break Buna, not through brute force, but through disciplined adaptation. The swamp had humbled the United States. Eichelberger's task was to teach the United States how to fight back. Eichelberger's changes did not transform Buna overnight. The jungle remained hostile, the Japanese positions intact, and the troops exhausted. But slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, the rhythm of the battle began to shift. The first sign came during a reconnaissance patrol that moved at dusk, not dawn. Previously, American units relied on daylight, believing visibility offered safety. But daylight favored the Japanese, whose bunkers were designed to dominate every approach. Eichelberger authorized patrols at the edges of darkness, when the bunker slits were harder to see but also harder for the Japanese to aim through. This twilight patrol mapped a section of the Japanese perimeter previously assumed impenetrable. They identified a narrow depression, barely waist deep, that allowed covered approach toward a machine gun position that had stalled 3 earlier assaults. The next day, a small team exploited that gap. The attack was not a grand maneuver. It was a technical operation. 2 riflemen advanced low, almost crawling. A Browning automatic rifle team provided angled fire to pin the defenders. Engineers followed with satchel charges, heavy canvas bags filled with TNT and fused for short detonation. The depression gave them just enough concealment to reach the bunker's flank. The satchel charge detonated with a muffled thud. The coconut logs absorbed much of the sound. When the dust settled, the bunker's firing port sagged inward. For the first time in weeks, an American assault had destroyed a Japanese position on the first attempt. Word spread quickly. Not triumph, relief. The success validated a doctrine that had not existed weeks earlier. Target a bunker individually, neutralize it efficiently, then move to the next. Large formations were useless here. Precision was the new advantage. American units reorganized into small teams built for specific roles. Recon teams to chart every trench, port, and firing lane. Bar teams to suppress specific targets. Engineer teams carrying explosives, wire cutters, and improvised tools. Flamethrower operators used sparingly, primarily to clear entrenchments after demolition. This modular structure turned the battle into a series of micro-engagements, each one a problem to be solved with a tailored approach. It resembled more a technical excavation than a battlefield. The Japanese adapted, of course. They shifted snipers to counter new infiltration routes. They moved machine guns between bunkers at night. They anticipated American feints. But adaptation favored the attackers now, not the defenders. American units learned to read the terrain. A line of disturbed roots suggested a camouflaged trench. A gap in kunai grass indicated a firing lane. Even odor became a clue. The faint smell of oil or cooked rice hinted at a bunker entrance. Engineers developed a technique of probing the ground ahead with long poles to detect hollow spaces under the earth. This allowed them to locate bunkers before they opened fire. Soldiers began marking safe approach paths with strips of cloth tied to branches, a quiet language of survival and communication. Coordination between units improved as well. Radios still faltered, but runners, men chosen for stamina and navigational sense, kept information flowing. Platoon leaders carried notebooks filled with hand-drawn maps, annotated with distances, landmarks, and warnings. It was the beginning of an ad hoc cartographic system that would later become standard practice in jungle warfare. Perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For the first time, soldiers felt they were acting with purpose instead of reacting to chaos. They were no longer stumbling blindly into kill zones. They were hunting specific targets. They were dismantling a system. One bunker destroyed became 2. 2 became 5. Fields of fire that once overlapped now had gaps. Japanese counterattacks grew sharper but also more desperate. Buna was still a nightmare, but it was a nightmare the Americans were finally beginning to understand. The jungle had taught its lesson. Now the Americans were answering in kind. As the Americans grew more adept at isolating and destroying individual bunkers, the Japanese understood that the balance of the fight was shifting. Their defensive grid, once nearly impenetrable, now showed fractures, narrow gaps that expanded with each successful American demolition. The Imperial Japanese Army had no intention of surrendering those positions without a final, violent attempt to restore control. Their answer came at night. The first major counterattack began in the early hours before dawn, when the jungle's natural noise, insects, dripping leaves, distant surf, masked the movement of Japanese infantry. American positions, scattered along narrow ridges and soggy clearings, were manned by exhausted men trying to rest inside shallow, water-filled foxholes. Then the silence changed. It shifted in a way the veterans recognized instantly. Too smooth, too synchronized. Men sat up in the dark, gripping rifles slick with moisture. Bar gunners checked their magazines. Officers whispered for sentries to hold fire until they could confirm a target. But confirmation never came. The attack began without warning. Rifles cracked in bursts that felt impossibly close. Grenades arced through foliage, leaving trails of sparks before exploding in the mud. Japanese soldiers surged forward in small groups, shouting short, sharp cries designed to disorient. American defenders responded with automatic fire. Bars hammered in tight, disciplined bursts, their orange muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the shapes of charging figures. Machine gun teams, half awake, swung their barrels toward shadows and unleashed streams of tracer rounds that cut lines through the darkness. Visibility was so limited that many soldiers fired at sound alone. Branches snapped under rushing feet. Water splashed as bodies moved through flooded ditches. The jungle glowed intermittently with the flicker of explosions. One platoon near the government track, a narrow trail leading toward Buna village, absorbed the brunt of the assault. Japanese infiltrators slipped through the perimeter, crawling on elbows and knees, using the terrain as if they had been born inside it. They targeted NCOs first, aiming to disrupt command before hitting the rest of the line. A squad leader was killed instantly by a bayonet thrust in the dark. The platoon sergeant took command, rallying the men into a tight defensive circle. They held the position for nearly an hour, firing until their barrels burned hot, until the mud around them looked like churned earth from a plow. Elsewhere, American engineers found themselves defending positions they had cleared only the day before. Their explosives were gone. They fought with carbines and pistols, killing attackers at distances so close that the muzzle blasts lit the sweat on their enemies' faces. Slowly, through discipline and firepower, the Americans halted the assault. But the counterattack did not end, it transformed. After the initial wave, the Japanese shifted tactics. They probed flanks, tested gaps, looked for weak points. Their movement was silent again, spectral. Americans waited, fingers tensed on triggers, unable to distinguish enemy footsteps from the rustle of leaves. Just before dawn, a second assault erupted, this time aimed at retaking a bunker the Americans had demolished the previous afternoon. The Japanese fought with fierce determination, not to reclaim a strongpoint but to deny psychological victory to their enemy. The Americans held, barely. Casualties mounted. Ammunition dwindled. Medics worked by touch in the dark, tying tourniquets with muddy hands. When sunlight finally filtered through the canopy, the ground was littered with bodies. The air smelled of explosive residue, blood, and churned vegetation. The Japanese had failed to break the line, but they had delivered a brutal message. Buna would not fall quietly. The defenders would bleed for every meter, and they expected the Americans to do the same. The counterattacks did not restore Japanese dominance, but they slowed the American advance and reminded every soldier on the front that victory was far from guaranteed. For the men fighting in the swamp, one truth became clearer than ever. Both sides were reaching the limits of endurance. By mid-December, the battle for Buna had narrowed into a series of brutally specific objectives. Chief among them was the area American maps labeled simply as the Triangle, a wedge of jungle and swamp bounded by three critical points: the government track, the Duropa plantation, and the approach to the Buna airstrip. Control of this ground was essential. Without it, the Americans could not push toward the village itself or sever the Japanese defensive network. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They fortified the triangle with some of the strongest positions of the entire campaign. American units, advancing into the area, quickly discovered that every inch of the terrain had been engineered for maximum resistance. Bunkers were arranged in tight clusters, each one reinforcing the others. Sniper nests hid in palm trunks split open and resealed with natural fibers. Trenches connected firing points in intricate patterns, allowing Japanese troops to reposition quickly without exposing themselves. The ground itself became a weapon. Thick vines formed natural trip hazards. Knee-deep mud forced attackers into slow, predictable movements. Pools of stagnant water concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes. From the American perspective, the triangle felt less like a battlefield and more like a maze designed to break momentum. Eichelberger's new tactics were tested here under the harshest conditions yet. Bunker teams moved forward with a mix of confidence and dread. They knew the method: suppress, flank, demolish, but the density of Japanese defenses meant each bunker felt like a fortress within a fortress. The air vibrated constantly with the sound of machine gun bursts. Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns delivered a low, thudding cadence that carried through the foliage like the heartbeat of the defensive line. Bar teams responded in brief, controlled pulses, trying to pin down firing slits barely wider than a finger. Flamethrower operators crawled behind engineers, their tanks sloshing with volatile fuel. They waited for the moment a satchel charge stunned a bunker's occupants, then surged forward to eliminate survivors. It was a grim job, and many knew they would not survive more than a few engagements. But without them, the Americans had no way to clear the tight interiors where Japanese soldiers fought to the last breath. The Japanese countered every advance with remarkable precision. When Americans suppressed one bunker, another opened fire from an unexpected angle. When engineers prepared charges, snipers targeted them specifically. When teams flanked left, a concealed trench on the right erupted with rifle fire. Both sides bled heavily for ground that rarely measured more than 10 meters in width. One American platoon, trying to push along a narrow spur of dry land, found itself trapped between two overlapping fields of fire. They dropped to their stomachs as bullets carved furrows through the mud around them. For nearly 2 hours they lay pinned, unable to move forward or backward. Only after repeated smoke deployments, most of which clung uselessly under the canopy, did they manage to crawl out of the kill zone. Engineers faced their own nightmare. In parts of the triangle, the ground refused to hold a shovel. Trenches filled instantly with dirty water. Tools sank and disappeared. Defensive positions had to be built with whatever the soldiers could stack: logs, sandbags too wet to hold shape, even crates pulled from supply drops. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Men hit by sniper fire often died before reaching treatment. Wounded soldiers screamed for help that could not come. Exposing a stretcher team to the open was suicide. Yet progress, slow, agonizing, measurable in body lengths, did happen. Each destroyed bunker weakened the integrity of the triangle. Each cleared trench reduced the Japanese ability to counterattack. Each night assault, though terrifying, revealed defensive weaknesses. Toward the end of the month, American units reached the edge of the airstrip. The Japanese defenders, recognizing the significance, intensified their resistance. They poured fire into the approaches, defending not just ground but the symbolic heart of their perimeter. The Americans pressed on, not because they felt victorious, but because stopping guaranteed death. The triangle became the hinge on which the entire battle turned. Whoever controlled it would dictate the next phase. And for the first time, the Japanese defensive system showed signs of breaking. By late December 1942, the Japanese perimeter at Buna had compressed into several isolated pockets, each one fiercely defended, each one critical to the survival of the entire position. The most important were the old strip, the new strip, and the hospital area, a cluster of bunkers and trenches surrounding a former medical station. Together, they formed the last defensible arc around Buna village. For American commanders, taking these positions was not optional. They were the final barrier before the village, and the final proof that the Japanese grip on Buna was breaking. The old strip, a battlefield of bare earth and hidden death. The old strip was a narrow, overgrown airfield, its surface barely recognizable after months of neglect and monsoon rain. Once intended as a runway, it had become a wasteland of cratered earth, rotting debris, and shallow pools reflecting the sky through a film of oil and stagnant water. For the Americans, the open terrain was a rare luxury, a place where they could finally see the enemy's bunkers without having to guess. But the openness came at a price. Every approach was exposed. Japanese defenders had transformed the far side of the strip into a fortress. Machine guns were positioned to sweep the length of the runway. Snipers hid in the remains of signal towers or in raised dugouts camouflaged with kunai grass. American units advanced in low crawls, inching forward under intermittent fire. Smoke was deployed repeatedly, but the swirling jungle winds scattered it unpredictably, leaving gaps that the Japanese exploited. Bar gunners fired until their shoulders bruised from recoil. Engineers dragged sandbags to build temporary firing points, sandbags that quickly became waterlogged and sagged under their own weight. The old strip fell only after a coordinated assault involving 3 companies, 2 flamethrowers, and a series of satchel charges that collapsed the main Japanese bunker with a sharp, muffled explosion. Bodies and debris rained down as survivors fled into secondary trenches. The advance continued. The new strip, a morass of mud and machine guns. The new strip was even worse. Low ground meant constant flooding, transforming the entire area into a slick plain of mud. Tanks could not be used. They sank almost instantly. Soldiers resorted to crawling across planks or wading through water up to their chests. Japanese defenders knew this terrain well. Their bunkers sat on slightly raised patches of earth, giving them clean firing lines while forcing attackers into predictable approach paths. Machine guns fired in long, disciplined bursts. Every movement in the open drew fire. American platoons moved in squads, advancing from shallow depression to depression. Each time someone lifted his head, bullets snapped overhead, clipping the tops of reeds. Flamethrower operators were indispensable here, and also among the first targets. Many never reached their range bracket. Those who did found that the mud swallowed their footprints and extinguished any sense of direction. Visibility dropped to almost nothing when smoke and steam mixed above the water. Only when engineers dug narrow approach trenches at night, sometimes inch by inch, did the line begin to shift. These trenches allowed assault teams to emerge within grenade distance of key bunkers. The fighting that followed was short, brutal, and at times hand-to-hand. When the new strip finally fell, the victory felt hollow. The Americans were soaked, trembling, sick, starving, but alive. The Japanese defenders, those who had not fled toward the final defensive pocket, were silent beneath the collapsed log roofs. The hospital area, the last stand. The hospital area was the final knot in the Japanese defensive web. It was a maze of bunkers packed tightly enough that smoke from one explosion drifted immediately into another. Some bunkers had been reinforced with metal salvaged from wrecked aircraft. Trenches ran like arteries between the positions, allowing defenders to retreat, regroup, and counterattack with heartbreaking speed. The Americans found themselves clearing the same bunker twice, even 3 times, as Japanese soldiers reoccupied positions under cover of night. Fighting here was intimate. There were no long fields of fire. No sweeping maneuvers. Just close-quarters battles fought in tunnels, trenches, and rooms barely wide enough for 2 men to stand side by side. Grenades became the decisive weapon. American soldiers rolled them down entry shafts, into air vents, through firing slits. The explosions echoed strangely inside the bunker network, creating an eerie, hollow thunder. Flamethrowers finished what the grenades started. Casualties were awful on both sides. Medics were overwhelmed, often forced to treat men in knee-deep water. Stretcher teams fought under fire, sometimes dragging the wounded with one hand while firing a pistol with the other. By January 1, 1943, the hospital area was nearly encircled. By January 2, it was collapsing. By January 3, it was gone. What remained were silent bunkers, smoldering trenches, and the unmistakable sense that the Japanese defensive machine, once precise and deadly, had reached its end. Buna village lay ahead. The final phase was beginning. By early January 1943, the Japanese perimeter had shrunk to its final point, Buna village. Once a cluster of huts, a small pier, and a handful of administrative buildings, it had become a fortress of desperation. Every structure was reinforced with sandbags, logs, and debris. Every footpath was booby-trapped. Every surviving defender knew this was the end. For the Americans, the advance toward the village felt surreal. After weeks of fighting through dense jungle, narrow trenches, and waterlogged fields, they now approached an open space that resembled something familiar, a settlement. But nothing about it felt welcoming. The air was thick with smoke rising from smoldering bunkers behind them. The ground trembled faintly with distant detonations. Even the quiet felt dangerous. American units moved forward in coordinated segments, their lines tighter and more disciplined than they had been a month earlier. Eichelberger's influence showed in every gesture, rifles angled low, squads spaced carefully, engineers scanning for traps, bar teams ready to suppress any corner. The first resistance came not from bunkers but from the trees behind the village. Japanese riflemen, positioned in concealed nests, fired sporadically to slow the advance. But their shots lacked the deadly rhythm seen earlier in the campaign. Ammunition was nearly gone. Their numbers were low. Their coordination was breaking. When the Americans reached the outskirts, they found trenches dug through the village itself, narrow cuts between hut foundations, forming a defensive web. The Japanese who held these positions fought with a ferocity rooted not in hope, but in grim acceptance. They fired until their barrels overheated, then switched to grenades, then to bayonets. One American platoon advanced through a cluster of abandoned huts, ducking under low roofs supported by charred beams. Inside one hut they found a makeshift first aid station, blood-stained cloth, scattered medical tools, and notes written in Japanese script detailing casualties. The room felt frozen in time, as if the defenders had fled only moments before. Outside, the fighting intensified. Flamethrower operators swept through trenches, their fuel hissing as it ignited on contact with damp earth. Engineers dropped charges into bunker entrances, collapsing them into pits of splintered timber. Machine gun teams provided relentless covering fire, cutting down Japanese soldiers attempting last-minute counterattacks. A small group of defenders barricaded themselves inside a structure believed to be the village administrative building. They refused to surrender. American units surrounded the building, breached it from the rear, and fought through narrow corridors filled with smoke and debris. The encounter lasted only minutes, but in those minutes, every soldier inside confronted the brutal intimacy of the battle's final phase. By the afternoon of January 2nd, the last Japanese strongpoints were isolated. By the evening, most resistance had ceased. On January 3rd, Buna village was declared secure. The moment of victory felt strangely quiet. Soldiers expected jubilation, perhaps even relief. Instead, they found themselves staring at the village's remains, shattered huts, collapsed bunkers, fragments of equipment half buried in mud. The air smelled of burned wood, spilled fuel, and the faint sweetness of tropical decay. American troops gathered near the pier, some sitting with arms dangling at their sides, others standing and looking toward the sea as if trying to absorb the meaning of the moment. They had taken Buna, but the cost weighed on them more heavily than the rifles slung across their backs. Reports tallied casualties. Corpsmen moved among the wounded in hushed tones. Officers updated maps with lines that finally moved forward. Eichelberger walked through the village slowly, his boots crunching through debris. He spoke little. He understood that victory here was not a triumph of strategy alone, it was a testament to endurance, adaptation, and sheer human will. Buna had fallen. But no one felt victorious. They felt finished. And for the first time since November, the men of the 32nd Division allowed themselves a fragile thought. Fragile, because they had learned how easily hope broke in this place. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. When Buna finally fell, the battle ended, but the suffering did not. For most American soldiers, the days immediately after the village's capture were among the most physically and emotionally draining of the entire campaign. Combat had stopped, yet the jungle refused to release its grip. The first priority was evacuation. Wounded men, some of whom had lain untreated for hours or even days, were carried out on improvised stretchers made from saplings and torn shelter halves. Many were barely conscious, their bodies ravaged not only by bullets and shrapnel but by fever, dehydration, and infection. Medics worked through the night, their hands cracked and trembling from weeks of overuse, improvising treatments with dwindling supplies. Malaria, the invisible enemy that had stalked the division since its arrival, surged to new levels. Entire companies reported fevers within days of the fighting ending. Men shook violently in their sleep, sweat soaking their uniforms, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Some had to be guided when walking, their legs giving out from exhaustion and illness. Skin infections were everywhere. Corpsmen described flesh dissolving from prolonged exposure to moisture. Bandages adhered permanently to wounds. Antibiotics were limited, forcing doctors to rely on older treatments, drainage, rest, and hope. Some infections advanced too quickly to stop. Food shortages continued despite the end of hostilities. Supply lines were still fragile, and for days after the battle, rations arrived irregularly. Soldiers ate whatever they could find or trade, and meals became as psychologically important as they were nutritional. The first hot food many had eaten in weeks tasted faintly of smoke and metal from field stoves, but to them, it felt miraculous. Emotionally, the aftermath was disorienting. The transition from constant threat to sudden silence left many soldiers unmoored. They had lived for weeks with the expectation of imminent death. Now, when they walked through the ruins of Buna village, their brains struggled to shift out of survival mode. Some men wandered the village aimlessly, touching fragments of collapsed bunkers as if to confirm they were real. Others sat alone, staring at the ground, replaying moments of the battle, a friend falling, a bunker exploding, the scream of an unseen enemy. Many cried quietly, not from sadness alone but from release. Commanders faced their own reckoning. Maps laid out on makeshift tables showed the progress that had cost so much. They reviewed casualty figures that felt abstract until they visited aid stations. The numbers became faces. Faces became memories. And memories became something heavier, responsibility. Eichelberger walked the perimeter daily. Soldiers later recalled how he paused whenever he passed the site of a major assault, not for ceremony, but because he understood the toll in ways that reports could never capture. In private, he wrote that the men had endured the most difficult conditions any American troops had yet faced in the war. Some units were pulled back entirely, too depleted to continue operations. Others were reorganized, combining remnants of multiple companies into a single functioning force. The division, on paper still intact, was in reality a shadow of what had arrived in Papua months earlier. The Japanese dead were buried quickly. There were no ceremonies, no markers, just shallow graves dug in ground that hardly allowed digging. The living had neither the time nor the strength for more. The dead, from both sides, became part of the landscape that had consumed so much life. And yet, amid the exhaustion and grief, a quiet revelation emerged among the American ranks. They had survived something that should have broken them. They had learned to fight in a place designed to destroy the unprepared. They had adapted under pressure that bordered on the impossible. And they had proven, to themselves more than anyone, that the jungle, though merciless, could be faced and conquered. But they also knew something else. What they endured at Buna would follow them long after the battle had faded into official reports. The scars of the campaign were not trophies. They were reminders. For General Douglas MacArthur, the fall of Buna was more than a tactical success, it was a political necessity. After the loss of the Philippines and months of Japanese expansion, the United States needed a tangible victory in the Southwest Pacific. Buna provided one. But the way that victory was framed, reported, and remembered would differ sharply from the way it was earned. MacArthur announced the success with dramatic emphasis, describing the battle as a magnificent victory, achieved through brilliant leadership and determined American spirit. His communiqué praised the heroism of the troops, emphasized the strategic importance of the position, and implied a clean, decisive triumph. The reality was more complicated. Commanders at the front reported staggering costs in manpower and health. Entire companies were ineffective due to disease. Equipment losses were severe. Every inch of progress had demanded innovation and sacrifice that MacArthur's statements barely acknowledged. Still, the political effect was powerful. In Washington and Australia, the victory at Buna signaled that the U.S. could stop Japanese expansion and push back. It reassured allies. It restored public confidence. It allowed MacArthur to claim momentum, something essential for his long-term strategic plans. But the true significance of Buna was not political. It was doctrinal. A new understanding of jungle war. Before Buna, the U.S. Army believed that standard infantry tactics, developed for Europe and North Africa, could be adapted to the Pacific with minimal changes. Buna shattered that assumption. The campaign exposed fundamental weaknesses. Insufficient training in tropical environments. Poor understanding of Japanese defensive methods. Lack of flexible unit structures for close-range combat. Inadequate logistics for terrain without roads. Over-reliance on weapons unsuited to humidity and mud. After Buna, the Army rewrote much of its operational doctrine for jungle warfare. Training centers in Australia and the United States introduced rigorous programs focused on small unit tactics, navigation by terrain rather than map, counter-sniper methods, sanitation discipline, and rapid bunker-clearing techniques. In effect, Buna became the crucible that forged the jungle infantry of later campaigns. Reinforcing the importance of engineering. The battle highlighted the decisive role of engineers. Without them, bunkers could not be destroyed. Without trail-cutting teams, units could not move. Without improvised drainage systems, perimeters collapsed into swamp. Eichelberger's reports emphasized engineering as a combat function, not a support role. The Army responded by expanding engineer battalions, increasing training for demolitions, and improving coordination between infantry and engineers. These changes would prove critical in future operations at Salamaua, La, Biak, and Luzon. The shift toward combined arms, even without armor. Buna taught American commanders that tanks could not always be relied upon in the Pacific. As a result, infantry began incorporating heavier firepower at the platoon level. Additional bars, bazookas, and eventually flamethrowers became standard components of assault teams. This restructured hierarchy influenced future amphibious operations, especially in the Central Pacific, where bunker fighting became routine. The psychological aftermath. Eichelberger insisted that reports reflect the true cost of the battle. His documentation of disease rates, morale collapse, and tactical shortcomings pushed the Army to improve rotation policies, medical planning, and the structure of frontline units. Although these reforms took time, they shaped the campaigns of 1944 to 45, where American forces demonstrated far greater resilience under equally harsh conditions. MacArthur's narrative versus soldier experience. MacArthur continued to promote Buna as a decisive moment, but soldiers who fought there held a more sober view. They acknowledged victory, but described it not as triumph, rather as survival. Their letters and diaries became some of the most important first-hand accounts of early Pacific combat, revealing a truth that official statements concealed. Buna was not a glorious victory. It was a lesson, paid for in blood, exhaustion, and human endurance. Yet it was precisely that lesson that made later victories possible. Buna reshaped the U.S. Army. It hardened its commanders. It reversed fatal assumptions. And it proved that adaptation, more than firepower, would define the war in the Pacific. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke from Buna drifted out to sea, what remained was more than a battlefield. It was a lesson carved into the collective memory of the United States Army, a reminder that wars are not won only by industry, firepower, or confidence, but by the capacity to endure the unforgiving spaces where all those strengths fall apart. The men who fought at Buna carried those memories long after they left New Guinea. Many never spoke of the battle. Others offered fragments, a friend lost in the mud, a bunker that would not die, the sound of insects buzzing around a stagnant pool while the air filled with gunfire. Their recollections shared a common truth. Buna was not what they expected war to be. It was slower, harsher, more intimate. It stripped away illusions. For commanders, Buna reshaped assumptions. It dismantled the belief that American troops, backed by overwhelming industry, could rapidly overwhelm any defensive position. It revealed the limits of equipment and doctrine. It forced generals to confront the nature of Pacific combat, a war fought not across sweeping plains, but inside claustrophobic jungles where logistics mattered as much as courage. For the Army as an institution, Buna became a turning point. Training changed. Leadership changed. Even the definition of readiness changed. The lessons learned there echoed through later campaigns, from the Numa Trail to the Philippines, where American forces moved with a sharper understanding of what jungle warfare truly demanded. But the deepest impact belonged to the men who survived. They left Buna gaunt, sick, and hollow-eyed, yet carrying a resilience few outside their ranks could comprehend. They had fought in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, against an enemy who used that environment with masterful precision. They had adapted under fire, abandoned old assumptions, and created new methods in real time. In doing so, they formed the foundation of the U.S. Army's future victories in the Pacific. When historians look back at the campaign, they often highlight the strategic implications: the halt of Japanese momentum, the proof that the Allies could retake ground, the establishment of pressure on the northern arc of the Southwest Pacific. But the soldiers who fought there would remember something else. They would remember the mud that never dried, the heat that felt alive, the silence of a jungle waiting for the next burst of gunfire, the weight of exhaustion that made every step feel borrowed, and the realization, whispered, never shouted, that the battle could have gone the other way. Buna was not a symbol of American invincibility. It was a symbol of American transformation. What emerged from the swamp was not a triumphant army marching proudly toward the future. It was a battered, wiser force that understood what war in the Pacific truly meant, and what it would require to win it. In the end, that understanding mattered more than the village, the airstrips, or the bunkers. It mattered because it changed how the United States fought. And because the men who survived Buna carried the weight of that knowledge into every battle that followed. The jungle did not break them, but it changed them, permanently, profoundly, irrevocably. And in the long arc of the Pacific War, that change was the first true step toward victory.